We are starting the Bellevue School District regular board meeting for July 13th, 2021. We have changed our setup here in the room with the new requirements, so that took us a little time to do that. But we are delighted to be here in person for this meeting. We'll start with roll call. I'm Francine Wiest.
Christine Chu. Erica Malie.
Seema Serafan.
Art Jarvis.
Excellent. And in case the microphone did not pick up, Director Watson did chime in as present. So that brings us to the next item on our agenda, which will be the Pledge of Allegiance. Dr. Jarvis, can you please lead us in the pledge?
I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next, I will do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge, honor, and respect that our broad community of Bellevue School District students, families, educators, and staff live and learn on the traditional indigenous land of the Coast Salish peoples. We thank the caretakers of this land who have lived here and continue to do so since time immemorial. I also want to note that the district has an updated land acknowledgement statement that is now being featured regularly. Next for acknowledgements, we had Independence Day this month. And now agenda item 1.5, approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
I'll second it. Any discussion? No? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Any abstentions or objections? All right, we'll take that. Motion carries. Next, the consent agenda.
Okay.
Is there any comment?
Yeah,
Or
I don't know if you know that we,
I don't think your mic
we
is on.
was at 2.9. I would like to move that we take 2.9 out of the consent agenda and consider it separately.
2.9 is removed from the consent agenda. Anything else?
When we finish with the consent agenda, I have a question about the agenda that I was trying to put together, but it got by me too quick.
Okay. You have a question about the,
broader agenda.
oh, okay. So I move that we approve the rest of the consent agenda. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, okay, I have 5 ayes. Consent agenda carries. That brings us to item 2.9. Director Watson.
Okay. So 2.9 is concerning the BSD program, and I wanted to vote separately on it. I wanted to say thank you for showing us the MOUs and the cover documents that explain them. I think that's really good for the community to be able to see all of that easily. My concern with the BSD program is what I've said before, that they managed to survive for 20 years through the Great Recession. And I understand that right now it needed to be canceled for financial reasons, and there's a company that you could outsource to that's a for-profit company that will charge less for the service. But I am afraid that it's going to charge less for the service by treating the employees less well. And so I feel that this move, personally, my personal opinion is that this move is not good for the morale of other employees and for the morale of our whole district. So therefore, I wanted to consider it separately and go on the record with that position.
All right, thank you, Director Watson. Do we have any additional information?
I do. Jeff Thomas, Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources. There are a couple of things that I think are helpful in knowing the background on the MOU. The first is SEIU 925 did present this to their membership for ratification, and it was approved by 96.5%. That is actually a very high percentage approval for a challenging decision. The second thing that I think it's important to note is much of the language that's in the MOU related to placement of staff that have been in fact impacted over the last 16 months as a result of either job loss or furlough are being looked at again per the language in the current AISP contract. And again, it's really about taking one more review of all of the employees impacted and ensuring that the district's doing everything it can to try and find them placement within the district.
Thank you. So I appreciate that. I will note that when I read it, I did find it challenging, some of the language. So to understand that it is consistent with the general contract language, it does not represent a change at this point. However, just to express that we realize it's a challenging time. We want to provide stability to employees, and yet there is some way that the language is worded that it could provide instability to others. And in terms of looking at clarifying and aligning with our values, that we can do that going forward, but to understand that the membership did look carefully at the current MOU and approve it, but that we do have room for improvement going forward. Is that correct?
That is correct, Dr. Wiest. And we will be opening up the contract for a full bargain over the course of the next couple of months this summer.
Thank you. Director Chu, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a question actually. So I think that the Director Watson made a very eloquent statement in support of the importance of how well we treat our employees and we respect them with our values that I agree with. What I don't understand is if is a vote on this particular to support this MOU versus not supporting it, will that impact any of the decisions that have been made about what happens to employees? Like if so a vote that does not support this MOU, what does that result in?
Dr. Chu, a vote by the board not supporting the MOU would send us back to negotiations with the union, basically saying that the board did not support the conditions under which we would close the program. It would not impact the decision itself to close the program.
Thank you. And the MOU that's being presented to us today is the representative group for those employees in support of this agreement?
Of the MOU, yes, that's the group that ratified it by 95%.
Thank you.
All right, any further comments? All right, I'll make a motion to approve this item on the agenda. Is there a second?
I second.
Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any abstentions?
Yes.
Any negatives? All right, the motion carries. All right, that brings us to the next item on our agenda, which is the superintendent update. I would like to start the superintendent update by swearing in our new superintendent. All right, let's see the microphone here. Sure, okay. Here we go. So please repeat after me. I, Arthur Jarvis, do hereby solemnly affirm We'll start over.
Do
So it's all on.
solemnly hereby affirm
Thank you. That I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Washington,
and the Constitution of the State of Washington,
and will faithfully discharge the duties
and will faithfully discharge the duties
of Superintendent for Bellevue School District 405
of Superintendent of School District, Bellevue School District 405
in King County,
in King County,
State of Washington,
State of Washington,
to the best of my ability.
to the best of my abilities. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll bump elbows on that one instead of All right, thank you. All right, and then before I turn it over for the superintendent update, I want to present these virtual pins. One to Deputy Superintendent Eva Collins, so it will be a service pin. So thank you so much for stepping in as acting superintendent and bringing our district along these last few months. I really appreciate that. And then similarly, we'll start Dr. Jarvis off with a service pin that I'll give to you when I have the actual ones. Oh, here we go. We have some pins. I'll give this to you in a moment. So thank you also for stepping in as interim superintendent for our district during this time. And so with that, I turn it over to you for the superintendent update.
Thank you, Dr. Wiest. Members of the board, my first would just be, again, an appreciation to you for having entrusted me to be your superintendent for this coming year. It is a job that some wonder why you want to do it. And my comment to you would be, even as you have entrusted this to me, it is very clear that it's a huge element of how do we make this system work well for the children, the students of Bellevue. I recognize the responsibility and I appreciate the trust that you've given to me, and I will give you my absolute best to make it work for the staff, for the students, and for the community as a whole. I join you, Dr. Wiest, and members of the board in saying thank you to Dr. Collins for her service. This last month or so, I had a chance to finish my job in the Peninsula School District, but also to come into the district for up to about 12 days and work with Dr. Collins beginning the transition. I can say I've never worked with a more capable person and a person who gave everything she had to doing the interim and doing it well. I suspect her average day was somewhere between 18 and 20 hours in the last month, at least, that I'm aware of. And for that, the deepest appreciation and thank you, Dr. Collins, for a wonderful job. And I say that from the old hand that's been around a while and has done this a few times. Never have I experienced a better acting superintendent or the gift that you gave to the district. So my thanks to you. On that note, I think I would just finish my report for the evening.
Okay, thank you. Directors, are there any comments on either summer school resources, fall planning, or anything else on the superintendent update?
Perhaps a
Director
little bit
Serkin.
on fall planning.
Okay.
I didn't know if you had a general update or.
I have to get in the swing here. So you would.
I guess if there's anything to report to the community on fall planning, is this the time, or will we be doing that later? It's a question.
In terms of the summer, I mean, very quickly, I will quickly refer to Dr. Collins for any particular details, but the summer school has been well planned. It is underway. The essence is that we probably found more parents and more students interested in staying home this summer than we might have anticipated, but it's been an exhausting year, and so there's an excellent program underway. It is filling the holes that we identified, and in my opinion is an outstanding program that's being offered to the community. In terms of the fall is the focus of literally 99.9% of our work. We're not looking back, we're looking to the fall. Everything in terms of opening full-time in the fall for all students who wish to be there 5 days a week, including an approved MOU that discussed any of the impacts that would have with our staff. That is in place, and we are therefore fully headed towards the fall date. I would add that you watched this last week. The CDC updated their guidance in terms of masks. And I think I'm going to use that just as an example of we expect to see week by week, day by day, and certainly between now and the opening of school, updated guidance. We have told the world, the parents and the staff, that we will take all of that guidance into consideration. We will follow the guidance. But in this case, we wouldn't follow the guidance in the state, and the state continues to say that students in school will have masks and face coverings required. So while there's a permissive side from the CDC for those students and who are vaccinated, that's not the guidance that's being in place for the state of Washington for this fall. So I would report to the parents with 100% confidence that we are on a track to open. We are on a track to open well with our staff and our students. We've had an excellent response from students registering for the fall, and we are truly looking forward to this fall. And I think after the last year that you all have put in to be able to open the fall with joy and what's something akin to the most normal school opening that you've seen in the last 2 years, it will be joyful for all of us. So thank you.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Chu.
I think we're all excited about the school opening in the fall. I'm wondering, are we actively planning any particular celebrations or any things that will help bring us all back together, not only on a school by school basis, but on a district-wide basis to bring our community, our staff, our students, and our families and everyone just back into the same space, and to remind us all of why we're here together and how we can work together?
The short answer is yes, and I agree with you, and we concur. We need to have a celebration as broadly as we can. I have told people that we will have a bell ringing where the superintendent will be calling the children back to school, so that we can have that symbolic as well as really the constructive side. We're beginning a series of Let's Talk, where I will be presenting approximately a 3-minute, it's hard for me to stay in 3 minutes, but about 3 to 5 minutes of conversation about the various decisions and all heading for the fall. We're also beginning a series that will be We Are Bellevue, that will be voices of our students and our children, and the diversity that is in our community and the diversity that's in our schools and programs, and try to reflect that as students anticipate the fall and what's coming for them. But I think the in planning is still the question you're asking, and that is, will there be a community-wide celebration? And the answer is yes. We simply haven't got it all planned yet. Dr. Chu.
Thank you. It'd be great to hear more about that, maybe at the next meeting if there's progress.
We will bring it to you.
Anything else? All right, thank you, Dr. Jarvis. So that brings us to item 4, construction-related change orders and contract approvals. Dr. Jarvis, I see that Jack McLeod is on the line. Should we have him present this portion?
I do not have any updates. John?
I'll address these two
Okay.
items. 4.1 is requesting acceptance of the Newport High Stadium Storage Building for final acceptance, and a recommendation from the architect that the project has been completed in accordance with the contract documents and specifications.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to make a motion that we approve item 4.1. If I have a second, then we can take discussion.
I'll second.
Second.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions or discussion? All right, seeing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, motion carries. Mr. McLeod, item 4.2.
4.2 is the Interlake Boiler and Water Heater Award of Contract. And the recommended action is the contract for the Interlake High School Boiler and Water Heater Replacement Project be awarded to Northwest Thermal Hydronics in the amount of $572,000. On June 30th, 2021, bids were open for the Interlake High School Boiler and Water Heater Replacement Project. 6 responsive bidders. Northwest Thermal Hydronics was the lowest responsive bidder with a bid of $572,000. So we are recommending the acceptance and award of contract with Northwest Thermal Hydronics.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to motion to accept the item as presented. Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you. Any discussion or questions? Yes, Director Malif.
Just a quick one. It's noted in the memo that this company also completed Eastgate's boiler replacement project. Is there any reason for concern? This is obviously a much bigger building, bigger school. Is there, in your experience with them at Eastgate, was there anything that causes you to have any concerns about the project moving forward?
None whatsoever. And we've also checked references with other entities that they've worked with, as well as the design engineer that also has experience with this company and said that they do outstanding work.
Great, thank you.
Okay, anything else? All right, seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. All right, the motion carries. Thank you very much. All right, that brings us to item 5, public comment. Although public comment is not required by the Open Public Meetings Act, the board recognizes the value of public comment on educational issues and the importance of involving members of the public. Public comments should be addressed to the board. Public comments are not intended to be a forum for public discourse, but rather an opportunity to provide information relevant to the board's work. Board directors read all public comments received to board@bsd405.org. Note that portions of policy 1400 have been suspended secondary to COVID protocols. As a side note, it is a policy that we are considering today with updates. Additionally, the section on types of comments is suspended as out of date and is being revised. While we request that comments avoid harassing or derogatory remarks, please be aware for those listening that while a district value is respect, an open forum allows commenters latitude in their expression. There will be a visual cue when we move on to the next agenda item. The board generally does not respond to comments directly during meetings, as this could result in a violation of the Open Public Meetings Act. Commenters will have 2 minutes. I believe we have one comment today from a group, which will give 3 minutes. And this section that I just read, I believe we will be, as I said, updating that today with new consensus language. Ms. Yang, would you like to approach? And you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Dear board members, I'm here today to represent 5 board candidates to state the petition we drafted together in response to an open letter published on Bellevue Education Association website on June the 11th. Our petition has received 500 signatures and counting. This represents the voice of Bellevue community at large, comprised of students, parents, grandparents, and taxpayers from a variety of backgrounds in Bellevue who want their elected school board members to retain their legal right to solely select the next school superintendent. The open letter published on BEA website accuses the current Bellevue School District Board that they consistently demonstrated failures of leadership in ways that violate the WSSDA governing standards, and demand the board defer its authority to choose a permanent superintendent. These claims are both false and unfounded. We want to be known that as parents, taxpayers, many community members stand with us to contest and oppose this letter. The pandemic is not over yet, and many children's learning and mental health have been severely affected. It is a time for us to unite, not to be divided. As a community, we believe that through the collaboration between all the parties with a vested interest in our kids in this community and their families, educators, staff, administrators, and the Bellevue community at large, our extraordinary school district will be revitalized and our students will emerge from the biggest challenge of their generation stronger than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes our public comments. I will note that our volunteer board of directors very much appreciates the time and effort put into public comments and correspondence to us. For those who were not able to be heard in session today, submissions in writing are welcome. Our directors do read all of the comments that come to us, whether they're public comment or just for information written to board@bsd405.org. So that brings us to the next item, preliminary budget presentation. Dr. Jarvis, I believe we'll have Deputy Superintendent DeVita presenting this portion.
Yeah. Good evening, board. Thank you for the opportunity to present our budget going into the 21-22 school year. I'd like to introduce to you Jenny Hall, who is sitting over here. She is our budget director and was significantly involved in providing leadership as we went through the budget process. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that all of our staff who worked on this budget, not only did they work on this budget, which was a very complex and difficult budget to do coming out of the pandemic, and there were a lot of things that were not typical. At the same time, they've been implementing our new ERP system. And so it just put a pretty significant burden on them. And so I appreciate the extra work that they did on both of those avenues as we move forward with that ERP implementation. Let's make sure I know how to use this. There we go. So there's over the course of this previous year, the board has started discussing budget guidelines. And while they have not always been formalized or are in the process of being formalized, I did want to demonstrate that we have incorporated these guidelines not only this year, but for many years, because really they are the basis of sound budgeting and financial management and planning. We find ourselves at a time of transition, moving from a year where school was mainly via remote learning to coming back to full in-person learning. And we are at a time where it's unclear what we will be returning to in the fall with respect to the pandemic, meaning we don't know how much personal protective equipment will be required, how much additional cleaning will be required. We are erring on the side of being conservative and making sure that we have incorporated all of these things into the budget as it is presented. So the funds will be available for those items if needed. We do not have a large collection of collective bargaining agreements open as we move into the 21-22 school year, but that will change over next year, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. But our budget does reflect, and has always reflected whatever agreements we have for compensation and benefits in our collective bargaining agreements that are active. And if a contract is open and not yet settled, we will make assumptions regarding how we anticipate that agreement to come to an end. The budget always needs to reflect the work that's going to be done and the goals that we hope to achieve as a district moving forward. And this is true with this budget as well. It is aligned to our annual plan that has been outlined for you, and I believe you will be discussing subsequent to this presentation. And finally, we do always need to keep in mind that budgets are estimates, and there are a number of assumptions that are made going into them. And when you're building a budget, and some of those obviously have greater impact than others, such as our enrollment assumptions, but things do change over time, and so it's important for us to ongoing monitor the budget versus actuals and make sure that we are going to be in a strong financial position at the end of the school year. We do look at continuing to lower our reserves coming into next year and anticipate that we will be back within the range that the board has asked us to be within, which is the 5 to 6% of expenditures. So some of the base assumptions for this coming year, one is a pretty significant enrollment drop, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what some of the demographics and drivers are of that. But it would put us back below 19,000 students for a while. We were up pretty close to 21,000 students. We were flat for a couple years, and then moving into this school year, we dropped 800 students, and then moving into next school year, I anticipate us to be down another 600 students. This budget is built on the assumption that we will be in person with pre-pandemic schedules, meaning students will be attending all day, every day, as they were prior to March of 2020. And that while we will be offering some online school, it will be through Ingenuity. It will be funded via the Alternative Learning Environment, or ALE funding, provided by the state. My last check, which was last week, we had about 179 students enrolled. That spans all the way K through 12, and that enrollment is fluctuating. Primarily has been dropping as vaccines have become more available to younger kids. So we will continue to monitor that. But anybody who is enrolled in that program, if they decide they would like to switch over and attend in person, they are welcome to do that at any time during the school year. We continue to believe that in-person learning is the best form of learning for students, and so we would welcome their return into our school buildings. So there are some risks. Whenever you make assumptions, of course, there are risks that they will not pan out. And so we try and put together things that will help mitigate those risks and help us manage those risks as we move forward. Obviously, enrollment, as I said, is one of the big drivers of our budget because about 85% of our revenue is based on enrollment, whether it be our levies or the state apportionment. And so we are monitoring student summer registrations and withdrawals. We will continue to monitor enrollment through the summer, and we have included some contingency teacher positions in our budget expenditures so that if enrollment comes in different, we do have funds in there to add teachers. Often we will add those depending upon fluctuations between in individual schools, where, for example, we would need to add a 3rd grade class or some additional sections of algebra or things like that. So we do have the money in there for that. We also don't know that we've anticipated every need that students will have. We have put money in place to address some of the things we anticipate in learning loss or social emotional supports or mental health supports for kids. But we have held back about $850,000 in ESSER funds for the current year to help meet any unanticipated student needs. Overall, this is what our budget looks like. We expect to have a beginning fund balance this year of $28.9 million approximately. That's higher than what we anticipated ending at. So you can see the 2021 budget there for reference. We did anticipate ending the year at just about 23 million. As we looked at our actuals and where they're coming out, we actually think we'll be closer to 29 million. And then with a drop of about 8.1 million, lowering our ending fund balance to 20,711,000. As I said, enrollment has been growing since about 2004-05. We jumped all the way up to over 20,000 students. This year we dropped down to 19,500, and we're anticipating another drop to 18,928 as we look at the 21-22 school year. There are a lot of factors driving that. And so I just wanted to kind of show you some of them and talk through them a little bit. So one of the factors that we have been looking at is enrollment and the impact of the pandemic on enrollment and our extended stay at remote learning. Over the course of, well, on the graph are 5 years of enrollment that has our October enrollment, our January enrollment, and then our April enrollment to look at enrollment over the course of the school year. The top 3 lines are 2017, 2018-19, and 2019-20. The line in the middle is 2016-17 before we saw some additional growth. But the bottom line is this school year, which is 2021. You can see for many of the previous years, we were flat over the course of the year or a slight uptick. This year, we had a much more significant drop in enrollment. We normally lose around 700 students over the course of a year, but we generally get 700 plus new students enrolling at the same time. This year, we lost more students than we normally typically do. We lost 795 students, and we had a net loss of 271 students. As we look at those, we had about 15% of the students confirmed that they transferred to a private school or homeschooling in the state of Washington. And then we had 22 students confirm that they transferred out of country. Those rates are, the 22% is relatively typical. The 15% is about double what we normally see. Okay. So that is definitely an enrollment issue that we need to address. There's other things, though, impacting our enrollment, and those have to do with our housing market and the cost of housing and the cost of living in our area. This is the number of active units in our housing market. The active units include single-family homes, multifamily homes, condominiums, townhouses. So it does not include apartments or rentals. So these are housing units available for purchase. You can see August of 2020, we had 311. We stayed at 300. I'm not sure why we dipped so low in October. But this year, you know, we've been hovering around 140, 150. And at the start of July, we were down to 106. When there aren't housing units available for purchase, you're not going to have families moving in. And yet you still have kids like growing through our system. And so this is one of the things that is impacting our enrollment statistics. The second thing is the housing costs. And if you look at this is in comparison to some of our neighboring communities and what their housing costs are for the median price homes, the active number of units, as well as the median price per square foot. So for Bellevue right now, our median home price is 1.2 million approximately. As you look at Issaquah and others in the area, it's less with the exception of Mercer Island. And the median price per square foot is less as well. Which basically means you get a little bit more house for your money. So when people are looking for homes in the area, cost could be a factor for families. It's hard to afford a home that's 1.2 million as you're moving into the area. The other piece that I wanted to share is around just cost of living comparisons. When you look at the cost of living for Bellevue, it's significant, and the housing costs are a big portion of that. So 100 is the overall U.S. national average, and then the housing costs, it would be 100 as well. And so the overall cost of living includes housing costs, food, medical, insurance, all the typical expenses that a person or a family would spend. And as you look there, you can see that for housing costs, Bellevue, we're about 4 times that of the national average. And whereas Issaquah and Kirkland are about 3 times, Mercer Island is almost 7 times, and then you've got 3.5 and about double in Renton. If you look at communities, I changed it from Bellevue to Seattle as a comparison because every community has more expensive or less expensive suburbs, but I just wanted to look like regionally, because one of the concerns is where can people afford to move from in order to move to? And so you see there, Seattle is 3 times the national average, but you've got Chicago at the national average. Washington, D.C. is lower. LA is about the same as us. San Francisco's significantly higher, and New York City is about the same as us. So even though we have a lot of jobs here and a lot of opportunity, there's not necessarily a lot of options for people to be able to move here, selling their homes and having to buy in this community. And our rents are just as high as well. And so I think it's hard for families to move to this area. And so it's one of the concerns that we have on an ongoing basis in terms of enrollment. All right. So as we started looking at this year, one of the things that we have talked about was staffing for last year, and we were overstaffed versus our enrollment. There was a couple of reasons for that. One is that our enrollment estimate was high. Second reason for it was that we were really staffed in 2 different educational models, and whenever you subdivide your educational models, like we see it often in our schools that have advanced learning and regular education students, when you subdivide things, it's less efficient for staffing. So we knew coming into this year, and then with our forecast of reducing even more students, we knew that we were going to reduce positions. And so basically we had, this is as of June 1st. I know these numbers are dynamic and they change. But at that point we had staff reductions of a total reduction of 170. And then we brought some back on for various things, including new positions, some new hires with specialized credentials, and newly placed non-continuing contracts with specialized needs. So based on all that, we have a net reduction in certificated staff of 84, which is equal to the amount that we had forecasted we would be dropping based upon our new enrollment numbers and how they're spread between schools. In addition to this, there were other reductions made, one of the most significant of which is positions in central office are also being reduced, and that resulted in about $500,000 worth of savings as well. As we move into next year, one of the things that we really worked on was how to spend the ESSER funds. ESSER funds are the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds that were provided by the federal government. These are one-time dollars that can be spent over up to 4 years. We did not get as significant amount of funds as others did. The median value of funding statewide on a per pupil basis was over $3,000. Nationally, the median value was $2,700 per pupil. Our district got just over $1,100 per pupil. And so we did not get as significant amount of funds. And so we're looking at a 2-year spending strategy. But the point in this slide is that we are implementing things that we may want to move into our ongoing educational model. And what ESSER funds do is really give us a runway in order to do that. So the orange here represents strategies that will help with near-term recovery. Some of those we may carry forward, some we will not. And then the blue represents things that we've been wanting to do. It lays the groundwork for that. And then it provides us some time then to modify our current spending in order to absorb the cost of those programs into the school district. So these are the ESSER spending dollars that we are looking at here, and these align with the things that you see in the annual plan. So they're focused on a number of different areas. One is academic interventions, things like adding some additional co-teachers at our title schools, especially those with dual expertise to support students, providing additional math supports in middle schools, and then also implementing MTSS coaches and support, as well as tutoring to give kids one-on-one support to accelerate their learning and growth. There's some enrichment opportunities and then support at secondary schools with grad success. We've also focused on social, emotional, and mental health supports, both at the secondary and elementary levels, and family empowerment and engagement, both with supports through the Family Connection Centers, and then with support with families on a one-on-one basis through translation, interpretation services, a family coordinator for multi-language learning, and an ombudsman for families of students with disabilities. So some of the things, just as a summary of things that are in the budget, are the virtual academy, additional funds for disinfecting and personal protective equipment, certificated staff to return to our pre-pandemic class sizes, and then the additional certificated staff for enrollment fluctuations. Lastly, I did want to highlight a couple of things that we need to look out for as we move into subsequent years beyond the 21-22 school year. You know, we need to monitor what we're spending these ESSER funds on and figure out what is having the biggest impact and make decisions about moving that into our regular funding stream. And we need to do that on an ongoing basis. We also need to look at, during year one, are there modifications that we should make with how ESSER funds are being spent as we move into year two? Next year, we will have 6 of our 9 labor groups with fully open contracts, including BEA and our classified support staff, AISP. Those are our 2 largest associations. And so the impact of those negotiations will be significant on our 22-23 budget. The state is looking at a supplemental budget for the 22-23 school year. We don't know anything about that and what that will be. We continue to have concerns about enrollment that we will be monitoring. And then finally, we do have levy elections coming up in February of 2022 for both our educational program levy and our capital and tech levy. And those levies make up about 20% of our general fund budget. So they are significant to our ability to provide support and services to our students. Lastly, looking ahead, we do not have a pretty picture in front of us. And I wanted to, look, the bottom line is we will balance our budget because we have to balance our budget. But I put in some very basic assumptions here that I wanted people to see what some of those, the outcome of those would be. So I assumed a 3% salary increase across the board here. I also assumed enrollment would be flat. We assumed MSOCs, or materials, supplies, and operating costs would increase by 1% per year, that ESSER funds would no longer be available to us beyond 23-24, that there were no changes to any of the funding formulas, the levy limits, or anything else from the state, and that the state's measure of inflation that they provide us, which is the implicit price deflator, we use the state's forecast for that. So with those and we assume level staffing because of level enrollment. With those very simple estimates, our budget does not look pretty in out years. And so we're gonna have to be making some pretty difficult decisions as we move forward. if things stay relatively the same as they are right now, status quo. With that, the next slide is one that I have to show every year because it's a state requirement, just about how much MSOCs we got versus how much we budgeted to spend. And then finally, the capital and tech levy. This is how we plan to spend it in this coming year. It's pretty standard for us. There's not a lot of changes in this. This is pretty typical in terms of our refresh strategies for our student laptops, computer-based curriculum purchases, data center projects, facility modernizations, et cetera. And then finally is our capital building fund budgets, which, so this year we're in the middle of building Puesta del Sol, which will be done by the fall of 2022. And we plan to start Newport High School's capacity expansion in June of 2022. Over this past year, they've been doing virtual design with that community, parents, students, administration, and staff to get ready for that. And then this coming fall, we're going to be selling $100 million worth of bonds from our last bond election to support these projects. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions. I went through a lot very quickly, I know.
Who would like to start?
I think I have just a question. When you got to slide 17,
Okay.
you know, you said it's not pretty.
It's not.
Just maybe just walk me through, if you don't mind, where you would have wanted to be and where you project we will be, and are there things that we could, I mean, you outlined in the prior slide sort of things that we need to consider in terms of ESSER funds, contract negotiations. But if you think about things I will say, could influence, could control, if you could touch on that.
Sure.
So I guess maybe two things. One, don't assume people listening or even those of us here know what you mean by, you know, it's not pretty. In what way do you think, like, what concerns you most?
Mm-hmm.
What would you have thought, would you have wanted us to be, even not in optimal state, but even in a comfortable state? And then what things do you think maybe are variables we could possibly influence?
Okay.
Or,
So, so basically this has us having higher expenditures than revenue. 85% of our expenditures are salaries and benefits. So as we look at our largest contracts being open, and the cost of living here and the inflation that is happening right now, all of those things, a 3% increase in wages is not significant given that framing, but the state bases their inflation off of a different measure, which is called implicit price deflator, which really measures inflation of all goods and services, including things that are sold internationally, business to business transaction, industrial purchases. And so it doesn't really reflect what consumers are seeing. And even the consumer price index does not include housing costs. So I really think that our negotiations are going to be really difficult based on current wages and wages in our community, and, you know, to even keep people relatively at market level, 3% is not exorbitant. So for us, it basically is going to come down to negotiating and either paying more people less or less people more. Now, where I would like to see these numbers, we really have got to balance our budget. So basically in 22-23, we'll have to find $14 million. In 23-24, we'll have to find another $20 million. because we've got to balance our budget. We have no more room to use our reserves. We're at our reserve limit. Did I answer your question?
Yes, so
Okay.
I think the only area that what you're saying essentially is the area where we would have, I'll call it control, in the absence of a higher source of revenue, which presumably could come from an unexpected increase in enrollment. Is that right?
Correct. And one of the
So
things.
that's arguably the variable you didn't mention.
Yes.
Your model would be something changes in your assumptions and we get an uptick in enrollment, but otherwise it's a question of redistributing money we have, and then we would take a trade-off either of, as you put it, either paying more teachers and staff and administrators, all of those who are who has contracts up for negotiation, pay them more but have fewer of them, or say we don't want to let anybody go, but we're not quite sure that we would be paying them salaries that they would think are competitive.
Right, and I left enrollment flat in this forecast with the exception of 21, 22. It's really interesting. So as enrollment drops, we lose revenue pretty much immediately. But we don't lose expenses immediately because that drop of 600 kids is across 13 grade levels and 29 schools. And so mathematically, you should be able to reduce 25 teachers. But we can't because we lose 2 out of this grade in this classroom, 3 over here. And it's spread so much that you don't lose it. So you've got the step function for revenue and you've got a slanted line for expenses, and eventually they catch up, but there's all that portion in there where they're not the same.
So I guess the question is, if you project out a few years, and you have, but is some of this that lag concept where you're saying essentially you build a model which has a longer life cycle for certain expenditures, and then when your student numbers contract, it takes a while for your district to absorb those fixed costs or long-term commitments, and then so one would say in the shorter term you run a deficit. I guess what I don't know is when you showed all those numbers, the exception was always Mercer Island, more expensive than we are per square foot, all the rest. So one would ask, well, why then? What is the difference? Because their housing is much higher than ours.
Right.
So.
Right, and I haven't looked at their enrollment and that type of thing. I'm happy to match that against ours. The other thing is we are making changes. So to keep our enrollment or increase it. So for example, previously employees had to be 0.75 FTE for them to bring students to our district. We lowered that to 0.4 this year, so that anybody who works 2 days a week can enroll their child in our district, for example. So we are making some changes to help with enrollment as well.
Okay, thank you. So I want to give other directors a chance to talk.
Okay, yeah, we'll move on. So we have about 10 minutes left for this section. So Director Chu?
All right, I have just a couple more questions, primarily on this slide also, so thank you. Building on Director Serafin's question, just want to be clear, what would it take in enrollment increase? Because at some point, when you increase enrollment, costs do increase, right? Like at some point, there's a critical point. So what would it take an enrollment increase to get this budget back to a good space? And also, if we can't find these dollars, what programs, do we know at this point what programs would be cut, or is that sort of something we'd have to determine?
Yeah, so, okay, one thing. So I can't answer that enrollment question because I haven't modeled it all out. And part of it is dependent upon where those students come in at, because so there's capacity in various classrooms throughout the district, right? And so depending upon where the kids come in at, how many teachers you would have to add, it's not a one-for-one. Like you don't get 25 students. and
Sure,
have
but
to
you
add
can't,
enough
you don't get to call that in both directions,
Right.
right? Like, so
Right.
if we've lost progressively to the point where we're maintaining teaching staff because we haven't lost enough to drop it, presumably there's buffer then to reabsorb students.
Right, there is.
So-
So I can't tell you that exact number right now, but I can do some modeling to
But
kind of
in general,
figure that out.
are you telling us that increases in enrollment at this point, overall, on average, would probably be helpful to the
Yes.
bottom line of the budget?
Yes,
Okay,
increases in enrollment would be helpful to the bottom line of the budget, absolutely.
thank you. And I also think that this slide and the way you talked about it really brings out some points that I'm not sure are clear to people who might have looked at the initial slides. So I just want to call them out and make sure that I understand.
Mhm.
Earlier in the slides, it shows us having a healthy reserve, and it shows us having a generous supply of ESSER funds, not in keeping with what other districts got, but we've got programming that we've assigned to those funds for the next 2 years.
Correct.
However, we told our legislators, we're not actually getting the funds we need to cover the expenses we've incurred in this COVID thing. So those two pieces of data almost tell a different story. And yet, when you get to this slide, it's clear that we'd be operating at a deficit. So we wouldn't really actually have those two things as stably as we do. So can you help me make sense of that and help
Yeah.
that be clear?
Yeah, so first of all, you do not get the ESSER funds unless you spend the money. Okay, so for the subsequent years, I don't have any of the ESSER spending in there, but I don't have the revenue in there as well. So that's the first thing. So the ESSER funds are actually a wash, right? So they're not really going to impact how much you have left in your reserves, and it's not like they build your reserves.
But you're saying in 2021, 22, we still have some ESSER funds left to apply, and yet we'd still be operating at a deficit. So we'd be spending those specific funds, but we'd be digging into other funds quite a bit, right? So I just want to, I just want to get rid of the, I want to address what I hear when I'm doing advocacy at the state level on a regular basis, which is you have plenty of money.
Yeah.
You have a generous, reserve, and you have these ESSER dollars that you're spending on programs. So clearly you have plenty of money, but we don't. And so I want you to help me make sense of that. Like, how would you talk to the legislators about that, or how would you address that when community members ask about it?
So the bottom line is McCleary worked. The bottom line is McCleary worked. And so while people historically have said we're a wealthy district, we were a wealthier district because we were grandfathered in at a higher levy amount than other districts. And so when McCleary came on board, we had a greater loss, and we have been slowly but surely absorbing that and cutting things. So that's one thing. The ESSER funds that we have, we're using for recovery, but those are one-time funds. And so they're not going to be available long-term for ongoing. But we're kind of having a perfect storm right now in that our costs are increasing vis-a-vis salaries and inflation. The state is not keeping up with inflation because the IPD is not a measure of inflation. So our salaries are going to go up more than what they're providing us. And that is a big piece of this. And our enrollment is declining. So we're losing that revenue on top of it. If you had revenue growth, the differential between what you pay the increase to employee salaries versus what the state is providing us via apportionment would not be as great because your enrollment would cover portions of that. One of the things I would like to also throw out is that the districts on the west side of the state, districts that have a higher cost of living, where they put those differentials like 6%, 12%, 18%, those regionalization factors on. We do not get that for our levy limits. And yet our levy dollars are spent on the same things that our apportionment dollars are spent on. So it really is further reducing our spending power in comparison to districts that have a lower cost of living.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're approaching the end of our time. Do we need to extend time? Other directors, do you have questions? All right, should we extend time? Director Watson, will you have questions? All right, how much time would you like to propose? All right, let's.
I'm sorry,
Let's
am I
start
being
with-
a little wordy?
Let's start with 10 minutes. So I move 10 minutes. There's a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, so let's go ahead. I think Director Malief was next.
Okay, well, you've answered one already, which was about the 3% and does the state that? And the answer was no, or at least not completely. So then one other basic question. So you had said in the tech levy funds, there wasn't much change. There was a change in the way students use tech this year. Like all the elementary students have their own tech now. So does that change anything? It's just made up for by the classrooms not having computers or something? Like how is that balancing out?
Yeah, right. So basically, we have a plan for rolling devices. So 6th graders get new devices, 9th graders get new devices. At I don't remember, it's K1 and 2 or K1 that use iPads. The iPads we're not going to have to roll as frequently because they're only in use 2 years, and so we'll reuse those again for the kids coming in. And then the other laptops will roll, so 2nd through 5th grade, and then we'll roll them then. So basically our plan is to refurbish on those timeframes, which leaves us then with that $3.9 million for student laptops and refurbishments. The plan is to basically have those be assigned to students and assigned to classrooms and available for teachers to use as needed. One of the things that we heard from elementary teachers and schools on an ongoing basis was it was hard to use those carts because you didn't know when you were going to get it, right? And so they hated to build it into their plans, their lesson plans, because they didn't exactly know if they'd be available or charged or that type of thing. This way they can really integrate it into their teaching process and their lesson plans.
Awesome. And then sort of a bigger picture question, in a worst case scenario in February, if our levies fail, what's that look like?
So that would be a 20% hit to our budget, which is huge. The reason why we hold our elections in February is because we can then run again in April. And so if we fail, we would obviously start planning our budget for the loss of all of that revenue, but at the same time, we would be running a second campaign to basically say, here's the things that that are gonna disappear with this 20% cut. And I would work to try and get them passed in April at that point. You know, one of the things with levies here versus elsewhere in the United States is that in many parts of the country, levies don't have to be renewed like they do here. So once they're there, and then any new election is an add-on. Here, these are replacements, right? These are like continuation of what you currently have. So it's important that we get that message out to our voters as well, so that they don't think they're just additive.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to just chime in with my 3, and then Director Watson, you'll have the rest of the time. So are we allowing other out-of-district enrollment other than the staff?
Yes, so right now we have waiting lists because we're trying to wait and see what's really going to happen in September. So we're tracking enrollment very tightly, and we're going to look the first week of August and see kind of where we're at. And then if we're lower than we anticipate, we'll open up spots at that point to allow additional out-of-district students. So that is another area that we're looking at.
Okay, and then Just the timeline, so looking for the next year's budget and anticipating that there may need to be large cuts. At some point, we don't have to discuss it too much today unless you have an answer, to get some sort of timeline about when and what that process will be for determining those areas.
Yeah, my expectation is that we're going to start working on it in September.
Okay.
Like it would have a big enough impact that we're just going to have to put together some, just here's some options, you know, kind of in a portfolio style type of thing, saying if we're going to get, you know, we could do this and this or these, you know, and then have kind of those options laid out for us to discuss well before we even get to January.
Okay, thanks. And then the last one is for the MSOCs on page 18, just since we're putting everything together. It's been mentioned over time, but can you just review why there's that $17 million net difference?
Yeah, so it's higher this year than it has been in the past, and the reasons primarily are PPE costs and the online. So the online buying that curriculum is all in there as well.
All right, and does this also include some of the essentially unfunded mandates regarding paying for yearbooks and things like that?
Yes. Yes, that would be part of this as well.
Do we have a sense of how much that is?
Yeah, I will get that to you. I do have a number, an estimated number on that. I'm going to say it's less than $1 million, but it's nearing $1 million. But let me get the exact number for you.
Okay, and is this also where the changing the mascots?
Yes, would also appear in here, and I've got an estimate on that as well that I can get for you.
Okay, so we're tracking that, and we have had requests, I think, from legislators to be able to present those numbers, so there's
Yeah,
a sense of the...
we are providing that information to OSPI.
Excellent, thank you. Director Watson.
Okay, well, we managed to. Erica, my questions mostly got answered. Erica got to it about what happens if we don't pass the levy, which was my big concern. And then you also went over what we would do for the deficits, even if we did have the levy. So I guess at this point, since everything I had was kind of answered, I would like to just point out that I really like what you came up with on the ESSER funds. It's like a little wish list that I've been harping about for years about could we have some more nurses and some more mental health screening and more FCC and an ombudsman. So I think that's great. So I'll just end with that.
Thank you. And that's really our teaching and learning folks that came up with that plan. So
no, it's great. So thank you.
Okay, so anything else? Okay, so with that, did you, Deputy Superintendent DeVita, did you get what you needed from the board? I realize it's mostly a presentation at this point, but as we're practicing our new meeting.
The next steps in all of this, I will provide you answers to these questions that I couldn't give you exact data on off the top of my head. And then the next steps are to advertise the budget hearing, and the budget hearing will be held at the end of August. And then there will be a series of things you're going to have to vote on. Sorry, I just went blank. Anyway, there's going to be a series of votes that you'll have to take at the end of August to approve the budget, and the budget has to be approved by September 1st.
And then with that, for the budget hearing, will it be largely this presentation here, or will there be?
Yeah, there will be some slight changes to, you know, they'll continue to go through and what I call scrub the budget, meaning make sure that, you know, things are in there correctly, that we're not missing anything. I don't expect any significant shifts. It'll probably be a shortened version of this, just to refresh everybody's memory. And then the hearing itself, rarely do we have people coming and asking questions, but I would welcome them to come and ask questions.
I actually do have one other question.
Yes.
On the part of the presentation where it says like worst things that could happen to us,
It doesn't say that,
or
does it?
something like
It
that,
sort
but
of does.
one of
It says
the
things to
things
watch.
one of the things is that enrollment drops further than expected. And I just wanted to understand the mitigation for that, because it said something about flexible positions, but I didn't quite understand what that means, because we can't get rid of any positions at this point. So even if our enrollment dropped by, 2,000 students, we wouldn't be able to eliminate positions for this school year. Is that correct?
You're correct. And what I really should have put in there is the wait list for out-of-district students. So we would bring in, we have those wait lists. We'd start contacting families and offering them enrollment opportunities.
Thank you. So there's nothing, that thing about having like 5 floating
Well, the
staff.
contingency teachers are there in case it's larger.
Got it. But
Right,
if
in
it's
case enrollment's
smaller,
higher.
there's no,
Right.
okay. But those can, so if we don't have it be larger, what happens to those 5 contingency teachers? Will they be
Nobody's been
assigned?
hired. Those are positions,
Oh, so,
not people. Because
gotcha.
we don't know what we would need. Do we need middle school? Do we need high school? Do we need what subject areas?
So they're in
so-
the budget, but they're not committed staffing.
Correct,
Thank you.
correct.
I have just
Director
one.
Serafin, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just had one question that I realized. I have wondered, and I've also been asked, what impact, there's several high rises being built for business in our downtown Bellevue area. They're future jobs for Amazon.
Yes.
When you did your projections, were those built in? And does that sort of infusion of jobs, which many people think of as infusion of traffic, infusion of many negative things, does that bring anything potentially positive in the enrollment in any of your calculations? So A, did you factor them in? And B, if you did, are they a net positive or not?
So yes, they're being factored in. A lot of the folks that will be in those buildings are already in the area. And so I'm not sure that they would necessarily be relocating to Bellevue. And right now we don't have a lot of housing inventory, and Bellevue is very landlocked, which is also one of our issues, right? Unlike like Redmond in Lake Washington or Issaquah, where they still have open land there where you can see subdivisions being built and housing being put in, whereas Bellevue is pretty landlocked. And so what you're seeing is housing, people buying houses, scraping, and then building something new on the land, which puts us in a little bit of a different position than other east side communities.
Okay. And then as we close this session out, so there was details on the ESSER funding spend. In the last 2 years, we had information on budget priorities to align with the strategic plan. Kind of what has happened to those?
So some of those are part of the ESSER funding right now, like the co-teaching, as well as some of the enrichment for before and after school, for example. So there is definitely a mapping there. And so those are the things that if we're going to carry them forward, we're going to have to figure out how do we do that within what our spending will be, along with the impact of negotiated contracts and those types of things.
Was there anything that was dropped or reduced? And from those spending priorities from the last couple of years?
Can I provide that information to you? I just want to go and really do the mapping and make sure that I'm providing a complete picture.
Okay, and then yeah, generally, if there's something else that has been a big, significant delta, that's not detailed because it doesn't specifically fall under ESSER funds, that would be useful to understand.
Yeah, and the biggest delta for us was staffing, and that was those 84 positions was pretty significant impact.
Okay.
But we're staffing at the same levels as we were pre-pandemic in terms of class sizes. And I want to make sure that we get that across. We're not increasing class sizes at this time. We're using the same models to determine staffing levels in buildings.
You can say it one more time if you'd like.
We're using the same models, and obviously there will be fluctuations for individuals, right? teacher A had 22 kids last year and she's up to 24 this year. We didn't change our model. It's just the number of kids in various buildings and grade levels fluctuate as you move through.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right, well, thanks for that presentation. So that concludes our preliminary budget presentation, and we can move on to item 7, annual plan, version 2. Dr. Jarvis, is that Deputy Superintendent Collins leading that section? Yes? Okay. Oh, and then I guess in keeping with our meeting norms that we're trying to establish, will you clarify for us what you would like to accomplish in the presentation and what input you need from the board?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weiss. Okay, just making mic check, making sure I'm. Thank you. Hi, Eva Collins, Deputy Superintendent on the academic side, and I'm really pleased to come back and talk with you about the annual plan. And I'm seeking approval of the annual plan. Approval of the annual plan will allow us then to move into school improvement planning. And I will try to make that connection for you and why that's so important for us to get that approval and move forward with school improvement planning as soon as possible. A few things that I wanted to say about the plan is that it does represent the district strategic plan. You were just asking Melissa DeVita about the strategic plan and the alignment in the budget. And this annual plan, if you think about our strategic plan as this 5-year large plan that we have these high-level goals, the annual plan is our, I call it sort of benchmark for that 5-year plan. So this annual plan does align to that strategic plan, but this was a unique year, and some of the strategies and investments that we will be doing in order to achieve student well-being and academic success will be different, as you heard, and more intense. So the annual plan is also aligned to our recovery plan that you approved earlier in the year. I think it was in June, at the June meeting. So a few key things. If we want to pull up the annual plan, Mike, and go to page 1, where you'll see that chart. Oh, sorry, Mike, page 1. Yeah, that's the correct document. Thank you, right there. Thank you. These are the big buckets that should be familiar from our strategic plan, but in talking with our stakeholders and considering all that we've experienced over the past year and almost a half, a couple of key things that we want to make sure our students are that we take into account when we go into the fall. One is, how are our students doing? How are they doing social emotionally? How are they doing academically? And in order to do that, universal screening, formative assessments will be important at the classroom level, but also district level. We do have some district required universal screeners, and we do monitor that data. But even more importantly, at the classroom level, those classroom-based assessments. So how are our students doing? And then what do we do once we know how our students are doing? And our goal is to understand how our students are doing and for all students to grow. So whether it's social emotionally or academically, we want to know how are our kids doing and are they making growth? And we call that at the Tier 1 universal level. When we recognize that some students need additional supports, that's where we go to a Tier 2 level, and we provide those additional supports to accelerate their learning or accelerate their social emotional growth and to support them. So the plan represents goals in areas for all students and for some students who need additional supports, both in student well-being and in academic success. I spoke about this last time, but just to reiterate, under the student well-being, we have 3 areas. The sense of belonging, remember, was paused while we were in the pandemic because the sense of belonging really measures how kids are feeling a part of the environment. And many of the questions that we were asking prior to the pandemic were things like, how kids were feeling that they belonged at recess or in their classrooms. And those measures did not seem appropriate at that time, and we had shifted to peer connection during the pandemic. But we are back to sense of belonging. We think that's a really important goal, and that we are back to that area, and that data represents where we were baseline, where we were the last time that we measured it, and then there's the year that's missing of that data when you look at that data set. Social emotional learning, we have social emotional learning standards, and we have social emotional curriculum and instruction, some that's discrete and some that's embedded in instruction. And we want all students to make growth in that area. And then mental health is the area that we started working on approximately a year ago, where we have some screeners to help identify where some students need additional supports and interventions and treatment. And it's for a variety of reasons, not just one reason. So it's not just one specific treatment, but then we measure whether or not students are increasing their coping skills. And we've had tremendous success with that. In the academic area, we want all students to grow. Like I said, wherever they are in the fall, we want growth and accelerated proficiency for kids who are behind. The graduation success is not just walking across the stage and getting a diploma. We want our kids to be college and career ready. I don't think that that's well represented in the single measure that's in the plan, but we do have additional data that we monitor and track around students taking college and career preparatory coursework. Who's enrolling in that? We look at it every year, and we take action at the school level on those measures. And that starts in 9th grade. The high school and beyond plan is something that we have also measured and shared with you that data, and that starts in 9th grade. The other thing that we've implemented in the past year as a strategy is an MTSS approach that also starts in the 9th grade, where we are monitoring students who may be at risk of not graduating on time, and we apply interventions. And then we measure again, and we go through cycles at the high school level. And then finally, exceptional staff and family and community engagement. These did not change. However, you'll notice that based on your feedback, some of the wording changed in the exceptional staff around educator diversity. Staff engagement was an area that we looked more at professional development during the pandemic versus staff engagement. Staff engagement is more of a how are we retaining staff and staff satisfaction with working in the Bellevue School District, and we certainly want to focus on that in the upcoming year. And we will continue to work on professional development, but professional development is more of an avenue to rather than a goal area. Family and community engagement is a very important goal area for us. Always has been, but we are really doubling down, and that will be something that we'll focus on at the Leadership Institute on how schools can look at their data, not just, I heard last time, I think it was from Director Watson, about we don't want a singular measure, even though we have this singular measure because it is our universal measure at the district level. At the school level, there are a lot of other measures, and many of them are qualitative through focus groups and affinity groups and other ways that schools capture parent and family engagement. And at our Leadership Institute, that's where we will be working with our leaders on how do you listen to, learn from, and lead with families, and what are some strategies that you can employ that are more contextual for your demographic and for the folks that you serve based on your own data and what you're hearing. And all of that to say that I think this annual plan represents continuous improvement. And continuous improvement happens most effectively at the school level. And stakeholder engagement on those measures and those initiatives and strategies that will get us where we want to be will happen at the school level through the school improvement plan. And that's why it's important that we can move forward after we approve this annual plan to the development of our school improvement plan templates that our schools can work with their teachers and communities, educators, and develop their specific targets and strategies to achieve those.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Director Chu?
I have a bunch, but we can start somewhere else if you want.
All right, I'll start with a couple. So first of all, thank you for the detail and the mapping of answering issues that were raised last time. I did want to make one comment on that under students and how we will reflect their voice. I noticed surveys weren't there. And so the two modalities that are being used would only be subsets of students. And I'm wondering, are we going to survey and use that data broadly so that all students have an opportunity for input?
Thank you for bringing that up. I did not fully complete that section, and when I went back and looked at my notes, I realized that all I put in there was focus groups and co-designing, and that did not fully explain the answer to the question, how are we learning from students? So I mentioned that family engagement will be a focus at our Leadership Institute, as well as student engagement. And so we will have panels of families and panels of students, and we'll be working with our leaders on how do you listen to, learn from, and lead with. That's the theme of our Leadership Institute this year, or at least part one of our Leadership Institute, which will be a 2-day institute. And how do you learn from, listen to, learn from, and lead with your students? So student engagement will happen in a number of ways at the school level based on the needs and the context of the school. So some schools may be flying high in certain areas and not so much in other areas based on their quantitative and qualitative data. And so their strategies need to reflect that and be responsive to what the kids want and need. One of the things that we've learned, particularly during the pandemic, is how much our students can tell, how much we can learn from our students and how great they are at solving their own problems. And telling it rather than us making assumptions about what our kids need and what's going to be helpful, even within sense of belonging. When we worked on the sense of belonging goal, and if you recall, some of our schools made tremendous gains. Those were the schools that listened to kids, brought the kids in and said, well, here's the thing. We noticed that you're not feeling this. What would it take? What's going on here? What are some of your ideas? And in having kids not only share those, but lead those ideas is what ends up having the positive change. And so I did not effectively reflect that in the notes, and I apologize for that.
Okay, thank you, because I agree with a lot of the sentiments that you expressed. The reason I wanted to bring it up is because in that context, it's important to have the focus groups to get that additional depth of information, and yet clearly not all students are selected for focus groups. And so without having the baseline surveys where all students have an opportunity for input, we risk making those assumptions about what students need and who needs services or supports. And so, you know, clearly it's an operational area, but I would strongly urge that we ensure that there are ways across the district and at all schools that we are not making assumptions about just who gets to come to a focus group.
I think that's point well taken. And during the pandemic, when we did survey kids more frequently, we learned a lot, even if we didn't have high levels of participation at all times. We learned a lot from what our kids would share with us.
And then my other questions are around the presentation of the data. So first of all, thanks for indicating the significance levels with the panorama data. I noticed that sometimes fall 2019 is indicated and sometimes fall 2020. And sometimes it indicates why, for example, with math, that the data wasn't fully there, but I'm not sure with all of them why sometimes that's the case. I think specifically, it's the first set says fall 2019 and then it goes over. So I'm just not sure if that's an oversight or not, but just if that could just be clarified. And then, but the main one that I had was that usually we see proficiency levels, and we see proficiency levels for some, but under the academic growth, it says percentage of students showing typical or high growth from fall to spring. So just to preface, as you know, I'm keen on the growth metric, and I know that was something that was going to be in progress and launched this year. My understanding was there was some holdup maybe in the planning with that. Does this represent that? Is this that? How is that different from the numbers that we've seen where previously it was percent proficiency? And just some information on now this growth measure.
We still have the proficiency rates. They're on the next chart. This one is different. It's new and it is growth versus just proficiency. Proficiency doesn't necessarily show growth. So for example, we have students in our advanced learning program, I'll use that as an example, where predominantly students are proficient or exceeding proficiency, but they may or may not be making typical or high growth. They could still be making low growth. And so we want our students, we want to increase the percentage of students who are making typical or high growth and minimize the percentage of students who would be making low growth.
Okay, so this is the growth measure that was provided by STAR essentially.
Correct.
And then these
Yes.
are just the percentages, so we have them as the new baseline.
Right.
Essentially.
We could have used SBA, but obviously for a variety of reasons, that's not going to be possible. We wouldn't have had baseline data. It's just
Great. So if we could get an asterisk there too, just with what the significance bars would be. So when we eventually see the data, there's an understanding, since this is not data that we've previously encountered. That would be useful.
Can you clarify that for me again?
So
The
for example,
asterisks.
with the panorama data, previously it was 3%, now here it says 4%. That, for example, if we went from 72% to 73%, that would seem to be an increase, but it's within the level, it's within the margin of error. So it's not necessarily, it's not a significant, represent a significant change.
Okay.
And so the same is needed here, because so for different data sets, I think for the SBA data, we say it's usually within the 1%, but Panorama, it's the 3 to 4%. So what does it represent for STAR?
Thank you. And I want to answer your earlier question about the first chart on student well-being, and we can add this as a note. So thank you for the question. The reason we don't have fall 2020 is we did not survey for sense of belonging because the questions didn't make sense in remote. So we switched to peer connection and we asked questions about peer connection, and that became our target area. Now with kids going back in person, we feel sense of belonging is important to revisit. And so we just don't have any data for fall 2020.
Thank you. All right, next.
So I'll add that.
I'm going to look over here. Director Watson, Director Serafin, any questions?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I could mention a few things. So we are, let's see. So I had some comments on the answers to the questions on the questions things. So I could ask those, and I also had some comments on the equity document.
Sure.
So I don't know what would make the most sense. So let me just talk about the questions of the questions.
Okay.
So I did want to know what exactly was co-designing in that context.
Thank you.
That was one. I have like 4 questions.
Okay.
Questions for questions. And then the other was the alternate ways of measuring family engagement wasn't really in the chart there, but I think you answered it in terms of just now when you were talking about it would be at the building level, but maybe we could kind of mention that or put some examples. And then I wanted to know what grades will be screened for mental health, because I thought I saw that in our budget with the ESSER funding that we'd be adding some screening. So that seems like that could be flesh out one of these questions. And then at the very end, I noticed that the creators of their future world, we talk about it as an initiative. And that struck me because that was the first time I'd heard it as an initiative. I thought of it as like an underlying vision. So maybe you could elaborate on that.
Okay, what do we mean by co-design? The idea of co-design is what I was describing about students bringing up ideas on how we can improve. In this example, it would be sense of belonging, but it could be anything. And having students co-design the solutions versus us saying, oh, you gave us that feedback, therefore I think we should do this. Well, that may not be the thing. You know?
I thought they were going into curriculum development, you know.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
could be.
So,
But
okay.
in this example, it's co-designing solutions to versus us making assumptions. So we look at a survey data, for example, and then we say, oh, this does not look good in this area. Let's do X without asking the kids.
Right.
Yeah, and having the kids actually help come up with X. And in many ways, that is creators of their future world. That's building that muscle of them having agency and developing solutions to the issues that they've identified.
But that is specifically in sort of the social emotional arena and not in the academic arena.
It could be in academic as well. It could be definitely.
So
I'm not.
And then the other one was the grades that would be screened for mental health. Is there more?
I want to say it's 3 through 12, but let me double check on that one.
But it's more than it was, I guess, is
definitely,
is the main point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we are expanding it. I think we had it at 2 grade levels prior, and now we are expanding.
Yeah, so that's good. Mm-hmm. And then the last thing was about creators of their future world being initiative or a fundamental vision or both?
It is our fundamental vision. Yeah. And then when you look at this annual plan and these goals, we can achieve all of this and our students may not be having the kinds of experiences in our P12 education that lead them to be creators of their future world. And so the initiative would be, what's our entry point? And I've talked before about potentially global competency could be an entry point into creators of their future world to help us start re-envisioning our P12 education and what are some experiences we would want kids to have and what are some different ways that we assess student learning and maybe putting some value on those and elevating those in terms of outcomes and indicators of kids developing as creators of the future world, developing global competency, what might we look at as indicators of that? And because kids can come in proficient in reading and math, leave us proficient in reading and math, and really never had the opportunity to go deep into global issues and develop global competency and be creators of their own, co-designing these solutions to global issues or local issues or even their own, personal.
Or get really inspired by something. It'd be fun to know, after they graduate, what they do. Yeah. I know that's hard, but, and then in terms of the equity document, I feel like that would be too kind of involved, but I had basically comments on every square, which is something I think Christine and I worked on this together for the, putting together the procedure and the questions that had to be answered or should be answered for the report. So my understanding is that there's an equity report coming out, like that'll be worked on and come out in August, because it just seems like I just had some concrete ideas about maybe how to beef up some of these answers in that third column, and it just seems like a lot to go through right now, but I think it could be important.
I think it could be worthy and important, maybe not right now, but as you can see, because this was just my attempt to align the annual plan to the equity and accountability. However, this is not proficient or distinguished in any way, but it's a beginning point. And now we can see where we have holes and,
I guess my question is, we're going to work on it a little more before we put it in the August thing.
Sure.
Because I just had some ideas, that's all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if there's specific elements of that that aren't answered in the annual plan that is up for approval tonight, then those would be addressed. But other than that, working on that document that then either feeds into the equity report or is mostly informational, that can be taken offline.
Okay, yeah, but Christine's
there-
raising her hand.
But hold on, so did you have anything that was specific to the annual plan that is, for example, missing on the equity front, or are you set?
Let Christine chime in. I just had, I don't know, I just had points.
Okay, so why don't we take, I think Director Malief has one point, no? Okay, it's covered, so Director Chu.
So I have several questions on the overall plan, but I'm going to focus right now on this one question that I think Director Watson has also raised. In our work, we have tried to consolidate so that we don't have 26 different plans. And when we passed the updated procedure for 0130, we said that the manifestations of the plan, the actual outcomes that we would have for the year for each commitment would be included in our annual plan.
Okay.
And so there's an expectation that the annual plan will cover how we will measure progress on each of our district commitments. And so when I go through this, some of these are strategies, they're not measurements. And some of these are, there's one of them that has a complete hole. It just says it's not in the annual plan and there's nothing else there. So in order to meet the requirement that the annual plan will show how we will measure progress on each of our district commitments, I think I would need more specificity on these items and also on the ones that are missing. On the ones that just map to goals, that's great. Those are perfect because then we have, a measure and we're good to go. And I think this is the first time we've ever done this exercise with the annual plan and the equity commitments and kind of crossing them. So this is exciting. And I really appreciate that you went to the trouble of doing this. I think that we need to take the next step though. So I'm wondering how we're going to take that next step and get that into the annual plan. Carolyn, is that in the direction you're heading?
Yeah, because I had things like, B doesn't align and D is a little whatever, and we could add, to G, we could add what happened to the recruiting trips to certain areas where you could get more diverse teachers, or on H, what are we going to do to make sure that happens? And I is the one I think where the hole is, and J, we need to talk about support groups that we actually have, like those already exist, so we just put them down. So like I had things like that, examples of the kinds of things I had.
It's really helpful. I appreciate you sharing with all of these insights with me because I wasn't directly involved in the development of it, but when I was going through these, some of them like F, not in the annual plan, but that doesn't mean we're not doing that. We are compliant with this with F. So what we need are indicators or evidence of our compliance with F, that we are achieving this, work with employee groups and staff to ensure that at least once every 3 years and within the first year for all newly hired staff, every staff member participates in professional development that addresses implicit bias, anti-discrimination, cultural responsiveness, and inclusion. So are we or are we not, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but that are we or are we not doing that? And what's our evidence that we're doing that?
Yeah, and on F, something like F, it's nice and simple because it's a straightforward, well, I mean, it's a little complicated, but it's a fairly straightforward, like, here's a thing that we promise we'll do every year. On most of them, it's a rather large goal. And so what progress are we going to make? And how will we know we actually made progress on advancing that commitment that we've made to our community?
Right.
And so that is something that is required in the annual plan, that it be covered for each of these commitments. So I want to leave it out there though. I don't want to undermine the momentum that we have and the excitement of kind of moving things forward. And just wonder out loud if maybe the way to deal with that is the board approved in the spring, kind of breaking the annual plan into 2 pieces this year. we said, just go do the top goals. Let's get focused. Let's not get lost in all the minutia of the tier 2 goals and the tier 1 and all these things. Let's get focused. And then, you know, by October, bring us those tier 2 goals. Let us know how people are going to carry out the tier 1 stuff on a department basis or whatever. I wonder if it would be appropriate for the equity commitment measures to come in at the same time as those come in so that we can keep everything moving. I don't know. We weren't specific about that in the motion that was passed that changed the timeline for the annual planning process, but that would be a suggestion that I would make. I don't know if that seems workable or if other board directors agree with that idea.
Yeah, so why don't we, so we can extend time. I don't know where we're going to take it from. But we are pretty much at the end of our time for this, and I think that there's more questions. So do you want to extend time? It means we will have less time for our policy work. Okay, so you want another 10 minutes? Okay, so there's a motion for 10 minutes. Looks like there's a second. Yes. All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All right, motion carries. Dr. Jarvis.
I wanted to jump in as you that door. I think right now, I feel like, of course, I've jumped on a moving train and I don't have the full history. But what I'd like to invite is that two things. We talked in the past and currently about the focus in the fall and really giving our staff every chance in the world to focus very tightly. Not to leave things out, but to say that has to be our number one job. So I want to reemphasize that. So as a way of assisting the board in this, I would invite you, if you would let me know the kind of things, you know, here's the plan that we've put in front of you. I certainly recommend it, ask for your approval. But then I would also invite you to, in a way, both educate me and add your suggestions on things that you feel we could improve the plan or ways of doing that. And at the same time, it keeps you out of the weeds right now of trying to jump in, as you say, all the tier 2 and tier 1 and the equity pieces. So I guess that's a long way of saying I'd like to recommend the approval of the plan. I'd like to acknowledge that that plan is certainly affected by what we're trying to do for the fall and committing the staff to that number one exercise of opening in the fall for all kids. And then thirdly, to ask you to please advise me and send to me and talk with me about things that you would like to see as a way of doing business in the future.
So I think, to be clear, that I don't think there's anything antithetical to what you're proposing right now. What I'm trying to say is, before you were here, we have policies, and the policies say that the annual plan will do this, and we passed a motion to say that the annual plan could just be the top tier goals in, you know, to be passed by August, and then we would add the second goals. We also have a policy and a procedure that require that we have clarity about how we will make progress on each of our commitments as part of the annual plan. We were not specific in the motion we made earlier about whether those would be covered in the first or the second round. So all I'm proposing is that to give everyone space to stay focused and keep moving for the purposes of the equity piece, why don't we iterate on this with the tier 2 goals? Not that, you know, if you can start making progress on some of it, great, but why don't we just iterate on that and not spend our time tonight trying to fix these?
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's where we're at. And then we can consider offline to determine to bring it, for example, the August meeting, how we would handle that tier 2 level. And for example, whether, as this highlights in the mapping, that perhaps it's not the annual plan, perhaps it's the annual report, and there's a broader bucket that's under the annual plan that indicates those other things. So rather than adding 10 more things to the annual plan, there might be a different way to do that. So we'll also need to look at that, because that's one of the board policies that perhaps instead of annual plan, it should say annual report. So we can look at that as well. But I think that's the way to handle the issue for tonight, since we've already passed and approved that, and that's where we're at in terms of the two tiers of the annual report.
Yeah, and let's not get mixed up about the
annual
annual
plan.
plan versus the report.
Right.
The
No,
the
they're
plan.
They're not
Yeah.
mixed. Annual plan. Okay. Anything else that you had before I go back to
I
Director
do have more
Watson?
questions, but if Carolyn has something on the
Just,
equity.
yeah, just some context on the equity so that's a great plan.
So
moving
rather
it with
than,
the-
since we're really out of time, so rather
Okay,
than
with
more
the tier two,
context
it's
on
a
this.
great idea, but I just want to make sure that people understand that equity is not tier two. Equity is woven throughout everything. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is that we looked people in the eye a year or so ago, and we made some promises, and the promises are listed in this document. And so we have to live up to those promises.
So
Totally
they
agree.
are woven in, and then there are a few additional things that are being done, but they're not things that go into the annual plan. Normally, there are other things that are being done. So we need to determine how those kind of basic operational things, like having training for staff, are reflected, and whether they continue to be reflected in the annual plan or report or something else we can bring to the next area. We're not dropping it. It will be considered.
So
Okay,
as you
anything
make
else?
that consideration, please use policy 0130 and procedure 0130P that we all just voted to approve in the last couple months, that has some clarity around what's required in that space, because that's what we all agreed to. I think that's what Carolyn's saying. We made an agreement, we made sure it was in the policy, and we got rid of a large piece of the equity reporting so that we could integrate it into the annual plan. And I think I don't know if I'm speaking for her or not, but I'm certainly speaking for me in saying that I agree, we've made a commitment to these things. And if we stop putting our eye on them as part of our regular highest level planning process, we will have failed. And that's not okay. So as you said, Francine, there are many ways we might be able to do it, but we are required to do it. That's what I just want to make sure that happens. So let me go, and I'll just share the other couple concerns I have with the annual plan right now. I have a question about the buy-in and the feedback that came. We have had a problem over the last couple of years with implementing things. We don't have stakeholder input from the folks who are asked to implement the goals. They feel like these things come from top down, and they're just put upon them, and they don't know how to integrate them into things. So what I'm wondering is, what did we do differently this year than in past years to get a different level of stakeholder input and stakeholder ownership in this plan, so that we can be confident our principals, our teachers, our para educators, et cetera, our counselors are in a position to implement this plan and feel empowered to do so. And then I've got a couple other questions, but I'll take that answer in the
So there's different levels of, my answer comes in different levels. So one is, when I said that this plan is a benchmark of the strategic plan, there was significant stakeholder engagement in the development of the strategic plan and those higher level goals. And that's what these are essentially. Now they've been modified over time, annually, based on either results we're getting or the context of the time or the need. Particularly this year, they've been modified around the recovery process and what we've just experienced. And so that part, so first level was strategic plan, stakeholder engagement happened at that level, and annually, we don't go back and re-engage everyone and say, do we still like these goals and whatever, we just continue to work on them, and based on our evidence or our context, we may have to shift or modify. We did have to shift and modify this year, which is how we have the SEL, for example, and the social emotional and the trauma. That's where we came to that over time. We didn't have that in the beginning when we first established the strategic plan. That process was also extensive, started with the Superintendent Community Advisory Council around what should be our highest priorities for recovery. That was an extensive process, but in addition, we worked with our educators. We presented this at teaching and learning meetings and got feedback on highest priorities moving forward, what should be included in the plan. we worked with our principals and all of our certificated administrators, got feedback from them. We put it out on the web, and we had a survey, and we got hundreds of responses, maybe thousands. It was a lot of responses that we read, looked through, and all of those things, if you think about the continuum we talked about earlier, lead to informed decision making. It's not a consensus or decision model, it's informed decision making. Ultimately, though, where these get vetted most appropriately is at the school level through the school improvement planning process. And so we have these big ideas at the district level, but at the school level, where they determine what are the specific targets that we have in order to achieve social, emotional, or student well-being or academic success, what are our specific strategies that we will employ, those are vetted through their own teams. They're building leadership teams through the educators and through family feedback. So that is done at the school level, and that's why the earlier we can get to them and they can get started on that, they generally start in August on that process of developing their school improvement plan. And ultimately, those come to the board as well for approval.
Well,
That's
right.
the process. It might not be the perfect process, but that is the process that we used this year specifically.
So I'll leave a comment on that and then see what the other questions are, and they're shorter, much shorter. On that one, I do question whether or not that's adequate for getting feedback for the annual plan. Yes, the strategic plan hasn't changed, but if all we were doing was working on the strategic plan goals, however, then we wouldn't need annual plan goals. But we're making annual plan goals, and what we've been told by principals and teachers, we just spent 20 hours in listening sessions, including many with staff, and we were told that, I can't do those goals. Those aren't the right goals. There's too many. There's whatever, this, that, the other thing. And so for me, I still, and I also heard in multiple sessions from multiple educators, things like, no one's asking me, no one's getting my input. And sure, we are not looking to get 2,000 pieces of individual input on everything we do, but feeling like plans are made, there's input and questions given, and they're not part of the process, and it feels very hard to then execute. So I do.
Director Chu, I'm going to interrupt for just a moment. So we're out of time here. We need to finish at 6:30. So that means that if we extend time on this, because we need to take a vote, we will need to defer policy 1400 until the next meeting.
I wanted to offer a different option. So what we could do is wrap up this extended discussion on annual plan, take our vote, and then could we move to August 9.2, 3, 4, 5, and just take 5 minutes to talk about 9.1. I'm not looking for us to get a vote on the edits made to 9.1, but I would like to get the board's response to some of my attempts to factor in the feedback from last time so that we can actually take a vote on 1400 in August so that we can kick off the year with the clarity that I know you wanted. So I hear you on everything. I would just say maybe we could push off 9.2, 3, 4, 5 to August, but then take 5 minutes on 9.1. But I concur that we're way over time.
That's acceptable with me. I'll second that. Any discussion? All right. So we'll do that, but we need to wrap this up. So all those in favor? That?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Motion carries. So if there's a question, do you have any more questions or anything that prevents us from voting on the plan?
I do. And then, so on that one, I do pose to the board that we should be looking at what level of stakeholder engagement and what level of stakeholder buy-in we have on things as we move forward. I do think one of the things that we have addressed that we heard from staff is that they wanted a more focused level. So it may be easier for them to do buy-in simply because there are fewer things to look at. So maybe we're okay, but I don't think we should stop here on the buy-in and the stakeholder participation. The questions that I have remaining are, one, I don't see anything in here as a major goal about the support that we can provide for just-in-time addressing of gaps. That's the thing that's pervasive across our students. And so we've got a lot of very thoughtful mental health interventions, and we have pre and post testing at the beginning and end of the year. But like the most significant instructional change that we need to make if we don't want to make the gaps bigger is how are we going to do just-in-time addressing of gaps? And I don't see anything that's really focused on that, and I'm wondering about what we're doing there and if it needs to be spelled out bigger. The two other things that I'm wondering about are grading initiative might be one of the single biggest things that could change our district. We just got a presentation that we were continuing that work, and it might be the most significant change of someone's experience, a large percentage of students' experiences that they have, and yet it's not reflected as part of the annual plan. So I would like to understand how that fits in and how we'll be ensuring that that has the right level of focus if it's going to have that kind of impact. And then the final thing is, I know you said you were looking at the high schoolers plan, but maybe related to the just-in-time gaps and the grading initiative, I'm still wondering what we're doing for 9th through 11th graders in terms of actual instructional learning and experience, because it just doesn't seem like there's much accountability for us to make sure that those kids are taken care of in the COVID recovery.
All right.
So those are my three. Thanks.
Okay. So in the interest of time, the annual plan has kind of the objectives, the initiatives and the objectives. So a lot of those questions I think are around strategies to implement those. So rather than going into the strategies in depth, can we just indicate yes, no, and where they will be focused?
So I don't think of these as all strategies. Like a grading initiative to change how we do grading is not a strategy.
The other ones.
I do see grading as more an initiative or a means to the end, but not necessarily a goal area for the annual plan. I'd be interested to hear more about how we might incorporate that as a goal. It is an important change. It is one of our key, I'll call them projects or initiatives on our sort of docket of things that we're going to be doing next year, but it isn't, I don't see it as an annual plan goal. The other, there was a second area before you got to high schoolers and I didn't quite get it. Oh, the just-in-time. I also see that as a strategy. I thought we listed it. I thought we communicated that well in our strategies that was in the appendix, but maybe we didn't. But just-in-time interventions is something also that came out of the pandemic time that we learned was a very effective but very challenging to implement during the pandemic, and something that we need to continue to do is the just-in-time. It is also something that we've learned through Achievement Network in our work on standards and how we assess students, and that if we apply just-in-time interventions versus remedial, that it's far more effective in accelerating learning for students. So just-in-time learning for kids, just-in-time learning for our teachers. That's why we're investing in co-teachers and coaching, so we can have more embedded professional learning versus the sit and come to a workshop once a month and hope that you will implement these things. That's why we're investing in PLCs and ensuring that our teachers hold each other accountable and support each other in implementing new practices. So I'm sorry that didn't come across very well, because that's probably one of our highest priorities in terms of strategy is just in time, and one of our greatest learnings. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, so I'm going to take it to a vote. I think the strategy discussions, they can be continued to be offline. I will share that I had expressed last time also about, I understand the annual plan. I understand why it's in, why it's pared down. I would like to see more about the creators of our future world. I feel like that's the excitement and joy that could drive the work, instead of just feeling like we're just focusing on recovery. And that's why the growth piece is so important. But I understand the way the annual plan is written and why it's there. And maybe we'll see something in the next phases. I understand that there is a lot of work being done in this area. It's just not as reflected in the annual plan. So I definitely, Dr. Chu, understand the the sentiments behind the questions and wanting to know more about the details around the strategy. But at this point, that's not so much the focus of this particular document. So with that, I'm going to call for a vote. All those in favor of what, do I need to make a motion? All right, I move that we approve the annual plan as presented. Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Can I ask a question?
Brian, determines your
I think
vote?
we need to
To
finish this
decide on my vote.
Go ahead.
You said that the work of the grading is significant work and it's not just. Is that something you anticipate will show up in the tier 2 goals or the equity work?
I absolutely see it showing up in equity work. I think it is part of systemic equity, and I think in order to achieve a systemic equity, we have to look at grading.
So if it would be reflected in the annual plan and those portions, I can vote for this.
Okay, so thank you. So there's no one against, no abstentions, so the motion carries. The annual plan is approved. Thank you for the presentation and the work of all staff done to get us this far. And then, of course, that now just opens up the next phase of work. So thank you in advance. So with that, board business, item 8, I don't see anyone having anything particular to share there. So we'll move to item 9. We are just taking comments on policy 1400. I will say that since we are not planning on voting on it tonight, I do have a number of comments that I have written down and I can share.
Sure.
With
Why don't
you.
why don't I start by just kind of calibrating where we were last time, and kind of putting in context the comments you gave last time against kind of what others had said. So just for context, part of the goal on looking at 1400 and 1400P, which I think I was looking at what you'd said and went back and listened to your comments last time on this, and you said, well, I think you've made kind of cosmetic kind of changes to this, but really the goal to revise this was to ensure that we didn't have a public comment policy that was at variance with essentially First Amendment law. So it was not kind of cosmetic, it was to ensure that we were snapping to the WASDA language.
So I agree with all of that, and I think
Okay.
I know where you're going necessarily, which isn't where I'm at. My things are very small about like holidays, elections,
Okay.
adding voicemail in there. They're very small. They're not
No worries.
anything. Well, there's maybe one.
No,
thing
it's
that
all
is a
good. If I
substantive
can,
question.
let me just
Yeah.
say that what I tried to do was a few of the things that you had said, everyone else kind of expressed agreement on. Like you had the most thorough, you started, so you gave the most sort of thorough feedback. And what you said was, you know, the main thing you said that was, I'd say, at variance with others was, hey, should we just repurpose the public comment?
And that's fine.
So yeah, others did not agree. And so I thought, okay, one idea I have, which I don't think is going to be reflected in the policies, but I think it's something we can and should do in parallel, is I think the recurring theme we've gotten is many people don't know what they should do for public comment. So I think no matter what, it feels like an opportunity that might, and this is where I'd like your feedback, it might find its place in 1400P, is to put something out that we should always have kind of a broader communication, and maybe it doesn't belong in 1400P, but a broader communication that tells people, and we should have a plan for this, we have more than one way where we seek input from our community, which I thought was your meta message and a very good one, which was we engage with our community through these multiple avenues. This is one of them. And so we could kind of, and this is where I wanted your feedback, I could try to find a way to put that into 1400P if you think that's the right place to do it, which is kind of commit ourselves to always making sure that our website, however, you know, operationally people think it should work from a communication standpoint, it tells people very clearly, and they don't have to hunt through our policy, what are the options for me to use to come and speak in person, or to your point, to use other means. And you said voicemail, and I know we know that there's email, voicemail. you also had made, I thought, a great point, which was if someone comes in person, we don't want them to get less than what they get when they email us, which is they email us and they say, essentially, my experience is broken and these are the ways it is. And we try to think of, okay, who could help you? Sometimes when they come in person, we don't have a system for that. So I think what you'll see across 1400 and 1400P is my attempt to try to address those things. But what I'd like, and you may be about to tee that up, is to know, do you guys think, I tried to put the least amount in 1400, the most in terms of prescription in 1400P, so that one would be more flexible than the other. But I'd like to know, do you think it's a good idea to reference in 1400P the broader ways we engage? Or do you think that's just something operationally that we could talk to the communications department about? It doesn't belong in policy.
I would lean towards the latter, and we've already been working on doing that, but you could add just a phrase that says, and it provides information on other ways to bring information to the board. But I wouldn't necessarily be more prescriptive in that. In fact, some of my questions are around that, which says like, and all regular communications and things like that. And it's not exactly clear to me what that is. And so if we only have a regular communication vehicle that goes out twice a year, we have special meetings that come up on on a more frequent basis. So then are you going to put out a special notice that just says that? So there were a couple of things like that where they felt like they became more prescriptive than is necessary. And then we would not, but I understand the intent, which is to be broadly communicating with our community through as many channels as possible. But the more prescriptive it becomes in there, then I think that we don't necessarily meet the spirit of it and we end up bogged in the details. So that would be mine overall. There's one that I just want to double check on. I'm pretty sure, I know it's in the Washington language and the behind it, but it does say that we would be content neutral in the selection of comments. And so I would think that as a board member, if I had many people coming in, I would like to hear some pros and cons on a particular issue or to select a breadth of comments. So if we had 4 hot button issues, we would want to hear about all 4 of them and not somehow just the ones who came first or randomly selected. We ended up only hearing 1 issue and not the other 3. So it does say specifically content neutral. I believe that is a requirement, but I wanted to check because the spirit of it would be that I would like to have some variability in that.
Okay, I will check with Felipe. I didn't interpret it as you need to create a system so that, for example, as people come in, because that would suggest I kind of need to know everybody who's coming tonight so that I can assess what topics are there and ensure I have a point of view that I know addresses it on either side. That for me is more of creating a paradigm that almost gives a wide variety of views. I interpreted this as saying the board will never select or tell you to stand down. Hey, your comment is derogatory to me, but you only, for example, inject that when people disagree with you, but somehow you don't find anything derogatory when they're in violent agreement with you. My sense was that it was more about the latter, but I will take some time to talk to Felipe and just find out kind of his point of view too. And now that we've talked about it in the session, I can also get more input from each of you offline as well. So I think that's valuable. But I hear you on that. I think the only thing I don't know is if we go to your kind of more of the former, your proposal, it would suggest we need to know kind of everybody who's showing up and then work back, reverse engineer so that we kind of have this full understanding of what people want to talk about. And then we go say how many have this and how many have that. And I wonder how complex that makes it.
So that's what we used to do, and that was in the previous policy. And having been the one to have to organize that on the fly at each meeting, it wasn't a particular tax. I mean, it can become it, and I think if we had tried, I think Francine did try to maintain that approach over COVID, but when you're getting like 50 public comments for a meeting, it did become an overwhelming task. But I think like making some sort of reference to like an attempt will be made to get a balanced set of views, maybe not like overly prescriptive, but that way when it is manageable, when you have 12 people or 20 people and you're doing a quick, they write down what they want to talk about, you can make sure you get at least something from every topic into the meeting and not 6 people coming and telling you the same stuff and then you miss out on everything else that people wanted you to hear. So there's something
Okay.
worthy. I found something worthy about that. And so maybe we can look into that.
All right, perhaps I will come up with maybe something and fly it by several of you, as well as Felipe. I think the only thing that comes to mind is there's sort of 2 things about who comes first. You can imagine 7 people show up very, very early, and they're all on one side of an issue, and they're all giving one point of view. So I can see the concern there. At the same time, the person who happens to arrive very, very early, who just really wants to speak, may end up lost in the shuffle of somebody balancing it out, and that might feel inherently fair. So it feels like, to both of your points, a lot of it's going to depend on that particular night and how hard it is. And so we can say these are aspirations that we're going to seek to fulfill, but it seems too hard to have like an actual, I'll call it promise or commitment, either that every issue will be fully balanced by pros and cons to a precise number, or that how early you arrive guarantees that you will speak. And I think that's a challenge too. So,
and we should make sure that we get adequate feedback because we can't run it by multiple people before the next board meeting. That would be a violation of OPMA. And since Goalcom is going to work on this, because if you show a policy to one person and then you show it to another and then you make a decision about that policy at a board meeting.
well, no, I mean, all I would, be, yeah, I mean, I hear you. I think what I will do is talk to Felipe about the right way to be able to do this so that we can hopefully get something passed in August and we can hit the ground running before our beginning of the school year.
Yeah, I'm just saying, let's make sure we get as
I'll
much
provide-
input as we can right
I'll
now.
provide my things, again, they're just small, like change parents to families. I mean, a lot of them are editorial, but if we can clean it up. Yeah, but so they can be cleaned up. Is there anything else substantive for the policy? Director Watson?
I'm just mulling this over because, I've experienced this a bunch of different ways. I almost got closed out the first time I came to us. I almost got closed out the first time I came to a school board meeting because I wanted to speak and it was on a topic that nobody was talking about. And I didn't know it was a thing to get here early, and we used to do it like right as you sign in.
Right.
Then we went to the green sheets that you shuffle, and that was okay until the pandemic, and then people started complaining that you're shuffling them wrong. So I almost wonder whether we should put them in a hat and pull them out. Get here between this hour, and your slip is in the hat, and we'll pull them out.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah.
Director Malif, Director Chu, did you have anything else? Oh, you're on Goalcom, so you're considering it. All right, so I'll just say mine quickly so they're there. I noticed you removed the summer schedule for August. We just, in terms of setting the meeting dates, we just need to make sure that August is somehow covered. I guess it means that it just covered like the regular one. Told you about voicemail, not having board meetings on holidays. We had also moved it for the general election when directors are being elected. So whether we want to put that in or not, because otherwise it just requires a vote, a meeting notice, et cetera. Move the meeting definition move the meeting chair definition to be first. It's now later after it's mentioned a couple of times. And the rest, I think, are administrative type changes.
Just a question on the holidays and general election, that feels like something belongs in policy, not in, the procedure, not in the policy.
I'm sorry, I'm doing both of them.
Okay,
This is
okay, got it, okay.
And the mic is, there's a thing about who wishes to attend on page 3 of the policy. I wouldn't put participation because it's attending the meeting. We don't actually have people participate outside of public comment, and that was a virtual reference. And then I saw that there was more added in about having additional public comment on certain issues, and especially on policy. And then it makes it seem like it's in addition, whereas our general public comment period, our normal public comment period does suffice. So for example, if we voted on the policy, this policy 1400 tonight, we've had 2 general public comment sessions prior to the vote. We wouldn't need to have a separate one, and it's open to interpretation, I feel, the way it's written now, that someone might say, oh, you voted on something without having a specific one like we do for the budget.
Okay, so can I make a suggestion, since some of those are very specific in context?
We'll
If
write
you
them
can
down.
just put it in an email and send it, I think since you've already spoken to them here,
Yes,
that will ensure that my notes are not inadequate. Thank you.
we'll do that. All right, seeing nothing further, I think since we've
One request.
did one request, go ahead.
Not on the policy, just, I think that it would be great if we do need to finalize our board committee plans for the year, and I think it is important that we all have some input on those, because the idea isn't so that 2 board members do decide what to do, it's so that we can kind of be efficient with our work, but that everyone gets to contribute to the direction and what gets done. So it would be great if we made sure we had time for that at the first August meeting to talk about the 3 draft plans that have been put out, and that maybe Tish could resend those to everybody. I think there was a mistake in the way the SIFE one went out, so half the information is missing, and then the others we haven't seen for a while. So if those just got sent out so that we could discuss them in August, that would be great, because we have to approve them by the end of August.
Yes. All right, so that's been noted. So thank you. So that brings us to item 10, which is adjournment. We are adjourned. Oh, so that was the end of our, did you have something else? Okay, that was the end of our general session. All right, we are going to be resuming to the workshop. There is a separate streaming link for that. For those who want to do that, it will take us a few minutes to move rooms. And then we are actually just breaking up into small groups initially. And then we'll convene at the whole towards the end of that.